Throughout the 1980s and 90s, the adventure game genre had been growing and evolving around the world. Japan was no exception with its unique visual novels. By the early 2000s though, many felt that these games had reached their peak and were starting to run out of fresh ideas. Shu Takumi didn't buy that though, and instead would go on to create a new series in 2001 that ignored the fantasy realms, dating simulations, distant alien planets, and horror-filled locales common in many other adventure games and visual novels. Instead, his series would take place in a courtroom, and his heroes would not be knights or explorers, but instead attorneys of law. Many thought the idea was silly and that a video game about legal trials would never succeed, but the titles went on to become one of Capcom's most popular and iconic series ever. This is the unique history of Ace Attorney. Ace Attorney's story starts 7 years before its first game, when a young Shu Takumi joined Capcom as a rookie developer in 1994. Around this time, Capcom was very open to new ideas and concepts from its employees, and Takumi had plenty of them. At one point, he pitched an idea he had for a detective game, but it, like many of his other project concepts, was denied by Capcom. Unlike his other ideas though, he held firmly onto this specific one. Over the next couple years, Takumi would bounce around Capcom on some pretty notable projects. He spent some time briefly working on Resident Evil 1.5, the original sequel to the first game that was later cancelled, before taking the helm as director on a new series called Dino Crisis. Takumi's position as director didn't last very long though, as his lack of experience plunged the game's team into deep confusion, causing development to move at a sluggish pace. He was hastily removed from the position and given the role of a planner instead. Takumi started to become very frustrated with himself and also with Capcom, but he continued on down his path. After Dino Crisis finally wrapped up development, a sequel was quickly greenlit. To his immense surprise, Takumi was once again asked to take the helm and step into the director's seat. He was incredibly confused and wondered if Dino Crisis 2's producer was either very kind or extremely forgetful. This time was different though. Takumi dug deep and reflected on everything that went wrong and all he had learned from his first time in charge. He took the bull by the horns and led his development team to a smooth and successful finish on the project, proving to Capcom that he could be a strong leader and a good director. Shortly after development wrapped in the year 2000, Takumi was told he could have 6 months to work on any game concept he wanted as a reward for his success with Dino Crisis 2. During this time, it was normal for Capcom to allow some directors to create games that had much smaller teams and budgets as a way to help train up their newer and more inexperienced staff members. Takumi had never stopped thinking about the pitch he had made for his detective game some years ago, and decided that the time had finally come to see this project made into a reality. Development began on the very first Ace Attorney title in late 2000. It would be a mix of a visual novel and an adventure game, with the goal of making it accessible enough for anyone to pick up and play. Rather than fighting off zombies or dinosaurs though, like in Takumi's previous works, this new title would take its combat to a courtroom of law and its exploration to various crime scenes. Takumi would put together a small team of just 7 people when he began work on Ace Attorney. The entire group was made up of many inexperienced new hires that had just begun working at Capcom. Atsushi Inaba would act as the game's producer, and Resident Evil creator Shinji Mikami would help oversee various parts of the project as an executive supervisor. Takumi would put everything he had into this new title, working as its director, planner, and scenario writer. It was a lot of work, but he was passionate about the project and would do whatever it took to make it succeed. Due to the smaller size of the team and the type of game Takumi wanted to make, Ace Attorney was first planned to be released for the Game Boy Color. However, a team at Capcom had already begun development on Mega Man Battle Network for Nintendo's upcoming new handheld console, the Game Boy Advance. The Ace Attorney team was very impressed by this new piece of hardware, and development quickly shifted over to it instead of the previously planned Game Boy Color. Probably the most well-known aspect of Ace Attorney is its main character, Penix Trite. In Japan, Penix is known as Ryuichi Naruhodo and is named after the Japanese expression Naruhodo, which means I see or I understand. Localizers gave him his English name Wright as a way to mimic the Japanese wordplay, and Penix was chosen simply because it sounded heroic. Penix was created specifically to be an avatar for the player. Takumi went out of his way to make sure he felt very natural and didn't have too strong of a personality, so that it would be easy for players to put themselves in his shoes. To complement and work off of Penix's more neutral character, many of the title's supporting characters were given much stronger personality traits. His court rival, Miles Edgeworth, acts incredibly proud and a bit cocky. His defense aide, Maya Fey, can be very silly, but also stunningly sincere. Police detective Dick Gumshoe is generally clumsy and scatterbrained, and Penix's childhood friend, Larry Butts, is often overly emotional and incredibly clueless. Penix also begins the game with a mentor named Mia Fey, Maya Fey's older sister, who was murdered very early in the story, but still makes many appearances throughout the game and other titles in the series due to her being a spirit medium. As previously mentioned, the initial concept for Ace Attorney was for it to be a detective game. Much of the title is spent inspecting crime scenes, gathering clues and evidence that can help you with your case. Very reminiscent of old PC adventure titles. But Takumi also wanted his story to be told in the same style as a visual novel, but with one big change. Rather than just choosing from a set of options that would influence the direction of the story, he wanted players to have to think more and input their own deductions. This desired change would inspire the courtroom gameplay of the title. Generally, after inspecting a crime scene and gathering evidence, the player would then move to a courtroom trial and need to cross-examine witnesses, listening to their various testimony. Within this testimony, Penix had to find and point out contradictions within the witnesses' statements, and then present evidence to back up said contradictions. This idea was directly inspired by Takumi's fascination with Edogawa Rampo's short story Psychological Test, where a perfect crime slowly unravels due to the criminal's contradictory testimony. It was an incredibly interesting and innovative concept for a video game at the time, especially for a lower budget handheld title. Players would have to work their way through 4 separate cases to see the game's story to its compelling conclusion. Everything culminated in a final courtroom face-off between Penix and Edgeworth's ruthless mentor, Manfred von Karma. While Ace Attorney is the series' title known outside of Japan, Shinji Mikami would give the game its Japanese title, Gyakuten Saiban, which translates to Turnabout Trial in English. Gyakuten Saiban would release exclusively in Japan in October of 2001 for the Game Boy Advance, and was met with favorable reviews from critics. It sadly didn't light the sales charts on fire, but it was still deemed a success by Capcom. People outside of Japan did not get to experience Gyakuten Saiban until it was re-released 4 years later in 2005 on the Nintendo DS as Penix Trite Ace Attorney. This version not only introduced touch controls and microphone functionality, but also added a completely new 5th case to the game for players to go through. A Japan-exclusive PC port was released in 2005, and then a few years after, the game would also see release on the Nintendo Wii. It would later receive an HD remake in 2012 as a part of Ace Attorney Penix Wright Trilogy HD for iOS and Android devices. This collection would later be ported to Nintendo's 3DS handheld, as well as the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, Nintendo Switch, and PC. After the initial 2001 Game Boy Advance title was received well and found moderate success on the sales charts, Capcom ordered Takumi to continue on and make not just 1, but 2 more sequels for its newest franchise. Once the first Ace Attorney had been completed, Takumi was satisfied with how it came out for the most part, and took a much-needed extended vacation after working himself to his utmost limits. He had figured that his little project had finally come to an end, but he returned from his vacation to find out he was wrong. Very wrong. Takumi's boss, Shinji Mikami, had other plans for Ace Attorney. He didn't just want a sequel, he wanted a whole trilogy. Even with the game's mild commercial success, Mikami had faith that it could become something even bigger and better. Takumi was floored. While he was happy to see there was so much faith in the game, he felt he had put every idea and concept he had into the original title, and was hesitant he'd be able to come up with enough new content for 1 sequel, much less 2. Ace Attorney's final case had also wrapped up the story nicely, so we'd have to figure out a way for these characters to continue on. Still though, he accepted his task and began work on Ace Attorney's first sequel, Justice for All, or simply Gyakuten Saiban 2 in Japan. He was given a hellish deadline at the start of the project to write out the entire game's story and script for each of its 5 cases in just 3.5 months. It had taken Takumi even longer to write out 4 cases in the first game, so adding a 5th and shortening the required time seemed a bit excessive to him. Regardless, Takumi buckled down and somehow managed to meet his deadline. Just like the previous title, this sequel would include 4 different cases to play through. One of the cases Takumi had fully written out eventually needed to be axed due to the memory constraints of the Game Boy Advance. Justice for All would not change too much from the first game, but it did add a few unique elements. Probably the biggest new inclusion was the Psyche Lock mechanic. Early on in the story, Penix receives a paranormal item called a Magatama. When questioning people at crime scenes, this Magatama allows him to see invisible psyche locks that form when people are hiding something. Similar to how the courtroom gameplay works, presenting the correct evidence can break these psyche locks, unveiling that character's secret and often allowing you to obtain additional evidence. Justice for All also now let Penix present character profiles as evidence, which added to the versatility and challenge of finding contradictions in the character's testimony. New mechanics weren't the only thing added though. Its cases and story were much more extensive than its predecessors, and many new characters were added like Maya and Mia's younger cousin, the innocent and sheltered Pearl Faye. Originally, Miles Edgeworth was supposed to return as Penix's proud court rival, but after Edgeworth had gained immense popularity with fans, Takumi decided late into development to introduce someone new that would have to lose case after case again to Penix. He would go on to create the arrogant prosecutor Franziska von Karma as a brand new courtroom rival and rewrote the game's entire script. Ace Attorney's sequel would launch almost exactly 1 year after the original title's release date in October of 2002, exclusively in Japan once more. Critics gave it an even higher rating than the previous game and praised its pacing as well as how it mixed seriousness and comedy. Just like the first game, Justice for All would finally make its debut outside of Japan a few years later in 2007 on the Nintendo DS. It would later be ported to the Wii and then included in the Ace Attorney Penix Wright Trilogy HD collection. A Japanese-only PC port was also released in 2006. By this point, Ace Attorney had moved from being an experimental low-budget project to becoming a series executives at Capcom were beginning to notice. But Takumi and his team were far from done just yet. Development on the final game in the Ace Attorney trilogy began almost immediately after Justice for All had been finished. There was no extended vacation for Takumi this time, and he felt even more fatigued and out of ideas for this third game than he had for the second one. Still though, he once again pressed on and ended up creating a unique story that even he was surprised at. This new third game would be titled Trials and Tribulations, or just Gyakuten Saiban 3 in Japan. The final chapter in the trilogy didn't really add anything new in terms of gameplay and mechanics from its previous title, but instead doubled down on creating a lengthier, more captivating story and diving much deeper into the series' characters. One big staff change that happened during this new title would be Noriyuki Iwadare, known for his work composing the music for the Grandia and Lunar series, taking over from Masakazu Sugimori and creating the game's soundtrack. Iwadare would continue composing music for many of the series' later titles. Trials and Tribulations would consist of 5 separate cases, one of which was brought over after being cut from Justice for All, the game's third case, Recipe for Turnabout. 2 of the title's cases are also flashbacks, where the player assumes the role of Miyafei, Penix's now deceased mentor, in her first 2 courtroom appearances. Much of the main cast from the previous Ace Attorney titles returned for the trilogy's finale, though a few new ones were introduced as well, like the innocent-looking Dahlia Hawthorne and Penix's new courtroom rival, the mysterious and chivalrous Godot. Players even briefly got to inspect crime scenes and argue in the courtroom as the fan favorite Miles Edgeworth, an idea that would return quite a few years later. The trilogy's final chapter launched in January of 2004, yet again exclusively in Japan on the Game Boy Advance, and a bit later on Japanese PCs in 2006. Just like its previous titles, it would finally make its way outside of Japan for the Nintendo DS a few years later in 2007, and then be released on the Nintendo Wii and in the trilogy's HD collection. Fans and critics alike were very impressed with the game's story and gameplay, and many felt that its plot was much more cohesive than in the previous 2 titles. By this point, the series had proved its staying power and quality to both Capcom and its player base. But Trials and Tribulations was the end of the story, the grand finale. Takumi had tied everything up and considered his now very popular series concluded. But we all know this isn't really the end for the series. However, the next game would not star Penix Wright, but instead a new lawyer out for justice. Once development wrapped up on Trials and Tribulations, Takumi began to oversee the game's trilogy being ported to the Nintendo DS over the next few years, and assumed he would simply move on to a new project once he was done. Capcom saw things a bit differently, though. They had a new, innovative, popular series on their hands, and the Nintendo DS was a runaway success and selling like crazy. They approached Takumi about creating a fourth game for Nintendo's popular handheld, but he was opposed to it. The story he wanted to tell had concluded, and he was happy with leaving it that way. Capcom didn't care much for his opinion though, and decided this series would continue on with or without him. Takumi eventually agreed to play ball though. He would write the game's scenario and help oversee its production, but he had no desire to be the title's director this time. That position would now fall to Mitsuru Endo. When development began, Takumi was incredibly hard-headed about one aspect for this new Ace Attorney title. He did not want Penix Trite in it at all, but instead for a brand new character to take the spotlight. A rookie legal defender named Apollo Justice would be created for this new fourth chapter in the series. His name in Japanese would be Ororoki Hosuke, which would be a wordplay translating roughly into a surprising boy of law. Takumi wouldn't quite fully get his way, as Capcom executives would convince him to add Penix Trite appearances throughout the entire game. This wasn't quite the same Penix as before though. He was dressed very sloppily due to being disbarred as a lawyer after unknowingly presenting forged evidence years prior. He acts as somewhat of a mentor figure for Apollo throughout the story, which takes place 7 years after the events of Trials and Tribulations. The player even gets to take control of Penix briefly during flashback scenes in the game's final case. The normal investigation and courtroom trial gameplay would remain mostly unchanged from the previous titles, though some new things were added to take advantage of the DS's extra power and capabilities. The game's director had originally wanted the title to move away from its 2D style and take more of a 3D approach when investigating crime scenes, but this idea was eventually scrapped by the game's producer, and the title stuck with its tried and true 2D investigations. Some 3D aspects would be included, however. Similar to the fifth case added into the first Ace Attorney DS port, evidence could now be viewed and rotated as 3D models to find additional clues. And there were now special forensic tests players would be able to use while investigating crime scenes, like dusting for fingerprints. Apollo also has a new skill where he utilizes a special bracelet to perceive a witness's nervous habit, kind of like picking up on someone's tell in a poker game. Gotcha! When the bracelet icon flashes, he can view the witness's statement in slow motion while they speak their dialogue, and must point out where and when the nervous habit takes place, then generally presenting evidence to back up why it is occurring. Just like most of the previous titles in the series, the game is broken up into 4 different cases, and added in some intriguing new characters, like Trucy Wright, Penix's adopted daughter who assists Apollo throughout the game, and Apollo's new courtroom rival prosecutor, Clavier Gavin. The game would finally release in 2007 in Japan for the Nintendo DS under the title Gyakuten Saiban 4, and then make its way overseas in 2008 as Apollo Justice Ace Attorney. It would later release on iOS and Android devices in 2016, and then the following year on 3DS in 2017. Unlike previous titles, Apollo Justice actually received a demo that contained a playable part of the game's first case. The title was received well by critics, who really enjoyed the writing, though some began to criticize its lack of innovation from previous titles. Fans also showed their approval, with the game selling over 500,000 copies in Japan alone within its first year, and then also performing well overseas the following year. After Apollo Justice, the mainline series would take a hiatus for over half a decade, but that did not mean there wouldn't be any new Ace Attorney games during this time. Capcom would instead begin to create a group of spin-off titles in the series, though they would not star Penix Trite or Apollo Justice, but rather a familiar prosecutor that had gained quite a bit of popularity and became a fan favorite over the past few years. Throughout the next few years, Capcom continued on with Ace Attorney on the Nintendo DS with 2 new titles that were not a part of the mainline games. Creator Shu Takumi finally pulled himself away from the series, and would go on instead during this time to direct the critically acclaimed Ghost Trick Phantom Detective, an idea he had been sitting on since the end of the third Ace Attorney game. Takashi Yamazaki would step into the director's seat for this new spin-off series. He had worked alongside Takumi for the first few years on the Nintendo DS ports of the original Ace Attorney trilogy, so he was quite familiar with the source material. These new games would star Penix's ex-courtroom rival, Miles Edgeworth, known in Japanese as Reiji Mitsurugi. Outside of Japan, the spin-off games would be known as Ace Attorney Investigations Miles Edgeworth, but in their native country they would be called Gyakuten Kenji, translating to Turnabout Prosecutor in English, and Gyakuten Kenji 2. The first spin-off would take place almost directly after the events of the third mainline Ace Attorney, Trials and Tribulations, save for one section, and the second game continues just a little over a week after the first Investigations title. Yamazaki and his team wanted these new games to feel familiar to Ace Attorney fans, but also stand out and introduce some new ideas. They would both play somewhat differently than the mainline titles and take place completely outside of the courtroom at various crime scenes. Rather than the normal first-person view while searching for clues, Investigations would instead use a third-person one as players controlled Edgeworth directly as he scrutinized a crime scene. Just like the mainline games, evidence is collected as you continue to search your locations, but a new mechanic is now available known as Logic Mode. As Edgeworth examines a crime site, he gains small snippets of information that are stored similar to evidence in a specific menu screen called Logic. Two pieces of logic information that either relate or contradict each other can be combined to gain new clues and help further the investigation. This system was implemented during development as a way of showing players how Edgeworth's mind worked in an attempt to help them better understand his character.
Take that!
Another new mechanic is the Little Thief, which creates hologram reproductions of the crime scenes and can be used to discover even more clues and evidence. While the Investigations games didn't generally take you into the courtroom, the gameplay from these sections remained intact through the game's rebuttal sections that generally occurred once a crime scene's investigation was completed. Just like in all the previous Ace Attorney games, characters would give their testimony and Edgeworth would need to find contradictions and present evidence to back it up. Investigations' sequel would not evolve too much from its predecessor, but added in one new type of gameplay called Logic Chess. These timed sections would be used against characters that refused to testify and were visualized as a game of chess. Edgeworth must alternate between talking and listening, aka taking offensive and defensive positions, in an attempt to take out the opponent's chess pieces and learn the truth from them. Many characters from the original Ace Attorney trilogy would make appearances in these titles, like Dick Gumshoe, Franziska von Karma, and Emma Skye, along with some new ones like Kay Faraday, a teenage thief who often assists Edgeworth at crime scenes, and Shilong Lang, an aggressive Interpol investigator who regularly crosses paths with Edgeworth and usually acts as his rival. Gregory Edgeworth, Edgeworth's father, also makes an appearance in the second Investigations title as a briefly playable character. Ace Attorney Investigations would hit store shelves in Japan in 2009, and then make its way to other countries the following year in 2010. Its sequel, Gyakuten Kenji 2, released in 2011, but to this day has never officially been released outside of Japan, though an English fan translation was released under the name Ace Attorney Investigations Miles Edgeworth Prosecutor's Path. Both titles would receive ports to iOS and Android devices in 2017, yet Gyakuten Kenji 2 still remained Japanese exclusive even with its re-release. Both titles received pretty positive review scores and sold moderately well in Japan, though Western sales for the first game were very poor and most likely led to the sequel never being localized. Roughly a year after the second Investigations title, Penix Trite Ace Attorney Trilogy HD would launch first for iOS devices before making its way to other platforms over the course of the next decade. It would be a compilation of the first three Ace Attorney titles and included updated graphics. After the HD trilogy was released, the series wouldn't quite be ready to get back on track with more mainline games, and instead would gain one more spin-off title. This new spin-off would not be a Capcom-only title though, and saw Penix Trite returning to the spotlight with an unlikely comrade from an even more unlikely partnership. During early 2010, Capcom received a message from another company asking about the possibility of a collaboration. This company was none other than RPG powerhouse developer and publisher Level 5. They were interested in creating a crossover game between their Professor Layton series and Ace Attorney. Layton's series producer Akihiro Hino knew it was a long shot due to Ace Attorney being such a treasured and guarded franchise at Capcom by this point, but he asked anyway. Shu Takumi had just finished up work on his DS adventure title Ghost Trick, so the timing was actually perfect for Level 5's request. After some back and forth discussion, Capcom and Takumi agreed to the collaboration, and development on Professor Layton vs. Penix Trite Ace Attorney began. Oftentimes with crossover titles, a series and its characters are simply licensed and one studio handles all of the development, but this was a full-fledged collaboration between both Capcom and Level 5 sharing the game's development duties. After having taken some time away from the Ace Attorney series, Takumi would make his triumphant return and become the game's co-director and scenario writer. Phoenix and Maya would appear in the game for the first time ever fully rendered in 3D. Characters now also had voice actors and were even featured in fully animated cutscenes throughout the game. While a regular occurrence in the Professor Layton titles, these were all firsts for the Ace Attorney series. Bones, an animation studio known best for their work on Fullmetal Alchemist and My Hero Academia, would handle all of the game's animated scenes. The title would share the puzzle-adventure gameplay of Professor Layton in the courtroom trial sections of Ace Attorney. During the adventure/investigation parts, the gameplay would be similar to the Professor Layton titles, where puzzles would need to be solved to proceed. The court segments were referred to as witch trials, in which Phoenix must defend his clients who had been accused of practicing witchcraft. The courtroom in this game wouldn't operate quite as fairly as in Phoenix's previous cases though, as the defendant was considered guilty until proven innocent. Forensics are completely gone, and the courtroom acts more closely to an angry mob rather than a composed group of witnesses. Something new added to these trial sections that differed from the previous titles would be the need to cross-examine multiple witnesses at once. Conversations could now jump between characters, as one witness's testimony could affect the opinion of another's and cause them to see the situation differently. This changed up the gameplay quite a bit and made cross-examinations a bit more interesting and challenging, since you'd have to juggle witnesses throughout the court proceedings. The title's cast of original characters like the kind and gentle Espella Cantabella and the dedicated Inquisitor Zacharias Barnum remained exclusive to this game and would not reappear in any later titles for either of both series. Layton Kyoju vs. Gyakuten Saiban was released in Japan in November of 2012. It would take almost a year and a half for the game to be localized outside of the country, with Nintendo acting as its publisher overseas. The title was released in Europe and Australia as Professor Layton vs. Penix Trite Ace Attorney in March of 2014. The game then finally made its way to North America in August of that same year. It was received favorably by critics who thought the two gameplay types mixed very well and created a unique and enjoyable experience. Professor Layton vs. Penix Trite never received any sequel or follow-up and remains a standalone spin-off title even to this day. Even though fans were happy to have this crossover game, many were ready to see the mainland series make its glorious return. Thankfully, they wouldn't have to wait long. During production of Professor Layton vs. Penix Trite, development on a new Ace Attorney had already begun at Capcom. This would not be a spin-off game like the previous three titles though, but instead a new entry in the long-dormant mainline series. For the first time ever, Takumi would barely have any major part in this mainline entry, as he was busy creating Professor Layton vs. Penix Trite. Instead, series veteran Takeshi Yamazaki, who had worked on many of the previous Ace Attorney games as a planner and directed both of the Investigations titles, took over to write the game's story and scenario as its director. He would also gain a co-director named Yasuhiro Seto that served as his backup and helped ensure the game's development went smoothly as Yamazaki worked hard on the scenario. The title was announced during a celebration of the series' 10th anniversary in 2012 and would be named Penix Trite Ace Attorney Dual Destinies, or simply Gyakuten Saiban 5 in Japan, and be developed for Nintendo's 3DS handheld. Similar to the crossover with Professor Layton, the game would switch to using 3D models instead of the usual 2D sprites it had used in the past. The team spent an absurdly large amount of time making sure they got the characters to look and move the correct way with this shift to 3D. They created concept models and then honed them down over the course of several months until they were happy they properly represented the original 2D sprites. Also returning from Level 5's crossover game were voice acting and animated cutscenes, handled once more by the talented anime studio Bones. Phoenix would make his triumphant return as the main character along with Apollo Justice and newcomer to the defense team, psychology expert Athena Sykes. The game consisted of 5 separate cases and took place about a year after the events of the last mainline entry, Apollo Justice Ace Attorney. As was the trend, the normal back and forth cycle of crime scene investigation to courtroom trial gameplay would return, but with some additional new features. Athena introduced a new mechanic called the Mood Matrix, which used her psychological prowess to examine the emotions of a witness and find contradictions between their testimony and emotional state. Also added was a new courtroom feature called Revisualization. The revisualization mechanic would be used to go over some of the facts presented throughout the trial and make a series of deductions to finalize their defense, often leading to a victory if the player succeeded. A notes section was also added into the court record that helped the player track what tasks needed to be completed during the crime scene investigation sections in an attempt to make the game a bit more accessible. Dialogue from earlier segments was also now readily available if the player decided to go back and check what a witness's exact testimony was. Dual Destinies included many new characters like the incredibly enthusiastic detective Bobby Fulbright and the game's intimidating new rival prosecutor Simon Blackwell. Fans would also be happy to see many previous characters return like Miles Edgeworth, Pearl Fay, Trucy Wright, and Clavier Gavin. The game would release in July of 2013 in Japan for the 3DS, and then worldwide a few months following in October. Outside of Japan, the game never received a physical release and was only available digitally. Capcom commented that this was due to difficulty in attracting long-term retail support for the Ace Attorney series. Later, it would make its debut on both iOS and Android platforms. Dual Destinies received very favorable reviews from critics, with a few going as far to say it was their favorite title in the entire series. Almost all agreed that the game's shift to 3D was done incredibly well and was helpful in breathing new life into the games. Not too long after its release, an additional case was added as downloadable content called Turnabout Reclaimed. Japan received an exclusive second piece of DLC titled Quiz Turnabout Deduction, though it was really just Ace Attorney characters asking trivia to the player, which mostly pertained to Japanese culture. Dual Destinies performed well sales-wise in both Japan and overseas, and it seemed like a new sequel was inevitable. However, rather than the next chapter in the mainline series, a spin-off game set in the distant past would be what came next for Ace Attorney. Development on Professor Layton vs. Penix Trite had concluded, Capcom approached Takumi about doing another Ace Attorney separate from the mainline series, which was now in the hands of Yamazaki. Takumi was intrigued at the idea and pitched a concept for a game that included the famous fictional detective Sherlock Holmes. The idea was greenlit and development began. It had been a long time since Takumi had written the scenario for a standalone Ace Attorney game, which made him feel a lot of pressure to create something that lived up to the quality of the series. Since this new game would be using Sherlock Holmes, it would obviously be set much further in the past than any of the other Ace Attorney games, and took place near the end of the 19th century. Part of the game would be set in Japan during the Meiji era, while the other would take place in Britain during its Victorian era. Moving to this new time period gave Takumi a fresh slate to work with and left him unbound from the rest of the series with a full cast of new characters. This new title would be called Dai Gyakuten Saiban Naruhodo Ryunosuke no Boken in Japan, which translates to Great Turnabout Trial, The Adventures of Ryunosuke Naruhodo. Outside of Japan, it would be named The Great Ace Attorney Adventures. Ryunosuke Naruhodo, an ancestor of Ryuichi Naruhodo, aka Penix Trite, would star as the game's main character. He would be joined by a large cast of supporting characters, like the aforementioned Sherlock Holmes, renamed to Sherlock Sholmes in the English release to avoid copyright issues, Ryunosuke's assistant Susato Mikotoba, an up-and-coming defense attorney who was good friends with Ryunosuke, named Kazuma Asogi, and Iris Wilson, Holmes's genius assistant. Barak Van Zieks, also known as the Grim Reaper of the Old Bailey, would act as the game's main rival prosecutor whom Ryunosuke would encounter in court throughout the game's story. Just like Dual Destinies, the Great Ace Attorney would use 3D rendered characters and environments, though a lot more attention would be given to the game's camera work in this title. As was the norm in the Ace Attorney series, each chapter would switch back and forth between the standard gameplay of investigating areas and participating in courtroom trials, though both of these segments would see some interesting new changes. Similar to Professor Layton vs. Penix Trite, Ryunosuke would often have to cross-examine multiple witnesses at the same time. The Great Ace Attorney would also now utilize a jury system, where a group of jurors would decide the trial's verdict instead of a judge, after the story moved to British courts. A somewhat similar concept had briefly appeared in the fourth mainline title, Apollo Justice Ace Attorney. Jurors could now interrupt the trial and cast their verdict whenever they liked, though they could also change it later if they desired as well. If the jurors all voted guilty, then Ryunosuke moved to a new feature called Summation Examination, and could cross-examine the jury to find contradictions in their statements and hopefully change their verdict. If the majority of the jurors changed their vote back to not guilty, then the trial would continue on. During investigations alongside Sherlock Holmes, another new segment called Dance of Deduction would occur, where Holmes would make various rash deductions based on details found at the crime scene, and Ryunosuke would have to point out flaws and contradictions to help steer him to the truth. Obviously, the Holmes in this game was a bit different than the famous fictional detective in Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's series of stories. The Great Ace Attorney was released on the Nintendo 3DS during July of 2015 exclusively in Japan and had a handful of limited editions that included bonuses like pins, soundtrack CDs, and plush toys. As had become pretty normal for the series, iOS and Android ports of the title would follow a few years later, but would remain restricted to Japanese audiences only. Any chance of the game's localization outside of its native country looked to be unfortunately pretty bleak. After development had wrapped on The Great Ace Attorney, a sequel was put into production almost immediately titled Dai Gyakuten Saiban 2 Naruhodo Ryunosuke no Kakugo, or The Great Ace Attorney 2 Resolve, as it was known outside of Japan. This game would be a direct follow-up to the first title and would take place roughly 2 months after the events of the previous Great Ace Attorney, with its setting remaining in Britain. All of the main characters would return and the game would play almost exactly like its predecessor. The story saw Ryunosuke once again dueling against Van Zieks in the courtroom, though he also would come across another familiar character whom he must later face off with in the game's trials. The title's gameplay would remain pretty much the same since it was viewed as simply the second part of the first game's events, and would bring the story to its finale. The Great Ace Attorney 2 was released exclusively to Japan once more in August of 2017, 2 years after the first title, and would also make its way to Japanese iOS and Android platforms the following year. This title would also not see a Western release, at least not for quite a while. There were some fan translations released, but nothing official. 4 years later though, Capcom eventually announced that both games would finally be making their way outside of Japan in a collection called The Great Ace Attorney Chronicles for the PlayStation 4, Nintendo Switch, and PC. The collection is currently scheduled to release worldwide later this year in the summer of 2021. While The Great Ace Attorney 2 is the most recent game in the Ace Attorney series as of right now, one more mainline title had been released in between these two spin-offs, though once again, Takumi would be too busy to write or direct it, and the duties would fall again on the team that had made Dual Destinies. After Dual Destinies had released back in 2013, one thing became very clear. The game had taken its toll on director and scenario writer Takashi Yamazaki and had exhausted him to the point where he had no desire to come back and work on the Ace Attorney series ever again. The game's producer, Motohide Ishiro, was impressed with Yamazaki's work and wanted him back on board as a writer and director for a sequel to Dual Destinies. To help convince him, he took Yamazaki to Comic-Con in the United States, and then to a Taiwanese press conference, so that he could see firsthand how passionate people were about his work and how much they valued what he had done. Thankfully, Ishiro's plan worked, and Yamazaki became inspired and energized to start work on the 6th mainline entry in the Ace Attorney series, titled Spirit of Justice, or Gyakuten Saiban 6 in Japan. Takuro Fusei, the game's art director, would work as the title's co-director to help focus more on overseeing graphical elements and gameplay mechanics, so Yamazaki, the game's primary director, could focus strictly on writing the game's story and scenario. One of the biggest pieces of feedback the team received after the release of Dual Destinies was that fans wanted to see more of Apollo Justice as the lead character. To act on this feedback, Yamazaki split the game into 2 separate locations so that both Penix and Apollo could share the spotlight in their own unique stories. Penix traveled to the eastern kingdom of Khura'in to see Maya Fey and got wrapped up in a series of legal events in the land, while Apollo and Athena remained in Los Angeles and had to deal with their own courtroom affairs. The normal trial and investigation segments would as usual be present, though a new mechanic called divination seance would be added to courtroom sections. During these seances, a vision of the victim's last moments would appear in a special pool on the courtroom floor, summoned by a new character named Raifa Padma Khura'in. Raifa would dictate various insights to her vision, and the player must point out the flaws and contradictions within them. Many of the gameplay mechanics from Dual Destinies would also return, like Psyche Locks, the Mood Matrix, and the Perceive ability. As was almost always the case with a new chapter in the mainline Ace Attorney series, many familiar faces would return, like Wright, Miles Edgeworth, Simon Blackwell, and Emma Skye, along with a cast of brand new characters like the aforementioned Raifa Khura'in, Princess of the Kingdom, and the new rival prosecutor, Nayuta Sadmadi. Just like the other more recent Ace Attorney titles, the game featured fully animated and voice-acted cutscenes, though instead of Bones, Animation Studio A1 Pictures would handle the workload this time. Spirit of Justice would launch on the 3DS first in Japan in June of 2016, before launching worldwide 3 months later digitally on the Nintendo eShop in September. A limited edition version that featured a tote bag, plush toy, drama CD, and poster card book was made available exclusively in Japan. The game would come to iOS and Android devices 1 year later in 2017. The title performed well sales-wise and received mostly positive reviews. Many criticized the game for its lack of new ideas and thought that the new divination seance segments were less intuitive than the tried and true cross-examinations. The game's story and setting were also slammed for being a bit too out there and unbelievable, even for the Ace Attorney games. Still though, most agreed it was a fun new chapter in the mainline series and enjoyed their time with it. Spirit of Justice is the most recent mainline Ace Attorney title to date, and with no new games on the horizon after almost half a decade, it's difficult to tell whether the series will continue moving forward. While the actual games themselves are a big part of the series' history, Penix became so popular that he made his way outside of Ace Attorney and into additional video games as well as other types of various entertainment media. Ace Attorney and its cast of characters had become very popular over the years after receiving many sequels and spin-offs. This popularity would see them go on to make cameos in a few of Capcom's other major titles. Marvel vs. Capcom 3 Fate of Two Worlds producer Ryota Nitsuma had expressed interest in making Penix a playable fighter, but it sadly never came to fruition. Instead, he and Miles Edgeworth were relegated to a short cameo appearance in She-Hulk's ending sequence. The game's 2011 updated version, Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3, however, would add Penix in as a playable character. Both Maya and Ace Attorney's recurring judge character would also both make cameos alongside him in Phoenix's moveset. When completing the arcade mode as Penix, he could be seen calling the game's final boss, Galactus, to the witness stand as a defendant. Penix and the rest of the Ace Attorney characters would make appearances in many other console and handheld games, including SNK vs. Capcom Card Fighters DS, We Love Golf, Project X Zone 2, Taiko no Tatsujin Dokudan Mystery Adventure, and Monster Hunter Generations. The series would also make plenty of cameos in a multitude of mobile titles like Puzzle Fighter, Street Fighter Cross All Capcom, Monster Hunter Explorer, Puzzle and Dragons, and Capcom Super League Online. The Ace Attorney series wouldn't be confined to just video games though, as its stories were adapted into many other pieces of media. In 2012, a live-action movie titled Gyakuten Saiban debuted in Japanese theaters, and would later see a release outside of Japan as Ace Attorney. It was directed by Takashi Miike and closely followed the events of the first game, though some changes would be made. Series creator Shu Takumi even makes a brief cameo during a celebration sequence late in the movie. Multiple musicals based on this series were also written and performed by all-female theater troupe Takarazuka Revue. Strangely, the musicals used the English localized names instead of the original Japanese ones, despite the performances taking place in Japan. Non-musical theatrical plays were also later written and performed, with actor Kentaro Kanasaki playing the role of Penix Wright. In 2016, the first of 2 anime seasons for Ace Attorney aired on Japanese TV and followed the events of the first 2 games in the original trilogy. The first season would be handled by A1 Pictures, the same studio that created the cutscenes for Spirit of Justice, though things would switch up for the second season and Cloverworks would take over animation duties. The second and final season covered Trials and Tribulations, the third mainline title in the series. So far, no word has been given on whether or not the anime will continue on and cover the later games. The series also saw various soundtrack albums, orchestral music performances, manga adaptations, pachinko machines, and even a theme park attraction. The popularity and love for the series cannot be denied and still continues on to this very day. Ace Attorney started out as a small idea in the back of Shu Takumi's head decades ago. It was an idea that continued to be pushed aside after it was pitched until eventually Takumi finally got his chance. The series redefined what an adventure game could be, and even evolved the Japanese visual novel genre to include more choices and interactivity in its titles. Ace Attorney showed you didn't need a giant budget or groundbreaking graphics to create an experience that could capture the attention of people around the world and become a respected franchise that continues to be talked about even years later. It's hard to raise an objection that Penix Wright and his diverse cast of characters have solidified themselves as a big part of video game history and will be forever remembered.
Hey,
Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this look at the history of the Ace Attorney series. This one was a very exhausting one to make, but also a really fun one as well. And I'm a huge fan of the series, so this video was going to happen one way or another at some point. This was meant to be more of an overview of the entire series rather than a deep dive into each individual game, so you can kind of see where things started and where they progressed to up until now in 2021. I can definitely say that I am very much looking forward to the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles coming out this summer. And if I had to pick a favorite in the series, I would probably pick Trials and Tribulations just because it feels the most well thought out and probably had the biggest impact on me from any of the other games in the series. So yeah, thanks again so much for watching. If you have any comments, questions, feedback, please feel free to leave them below, and hopefully I'll see you back for the next video. Thanks. Bye.